E2 Tech Podcast.
This is where that affordability discussion has its roots. We've seen a number of executive orders. We've seen tariffs. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act this past summer, which had some big implications for particularly renewables and a lot of federal tax credit money for decarbonization projects. What's been going on with offshore winds. Projects have been blocked and then delayed, and then court orders have been issued, and then in doing that are incurring massive costs. There is a view here where this data center build out ultimately benefits ratepayers, but it's got to be done thoughtfully. You've got to address some of the permitting issues, and you've got to address some of the bottlenecks. And affordability is front and center, especially in New England. We don't have enough pipeline capacity to get natural gas into our region. And this is one of the reasons why our electricity prices have gotten very expensive in the winter. It's complicated, and it's not, the solution is not an easy one.
Hi, I'm Orion Breen, Executive Director of the Environmental and Energy Technology Council of Maine, or E2 Tech. And with me today is Matt Gamache of Competitive Energy Services. Can you tell us a little bit about what is Competitive Energy Service? What do you do?
Yeah, we fundamentally exist to help our clients achieve their energy and sustainability goals. And that involves a wide range of energy consulting and advisory services, starting with basic commodity procurement all the way up through renewable project impact analysis, energy budgeting, price forecasting, always working on the side of an end user. So most of our clients are medium to large energy consumers located throughout the country, primarily in the Northeast is where we focus. We've had a big presence in Maine and have been around since really the beginning of deregulated markets, which dates us back now 26 years.
You recently wrote a blog article about a survey of the energy landscape today, 1 year into Trump's second term. Can you give us some highlights on what you see as the energy landscape today?
Yeah, I chuckle because there's a lot to bite off here. In signing up to write this blog post, I was a little wary of venturing into this topic. I think the landscape today has changed a lot versus where it was a year ago. I think even those who are not closely involved in the energy industry could probably tell you that. There's been a lot of news pertaining to energy. We've seen a number of executive orders. We've seen tariffs that have applied to all sorts of things, but including energy commodities. We've seen changes to federal permitting processes. We've seen the One Big Beautiful Bill Act this past summer, which had some big implications for particularly renewables and a lot of federal tax credit money for decarbonization projects. And that's really maybe just to name a handful. We've seen a lot of indirect activity as well. The types of positions this administration has taken on the international stage has definitely also had ripple effects in the energy industry. At a high level, I wrote actually a similar post a year ago, and the theme of that post was one of uncertainty, right? We had a new administration coming in. They had a lot that they wanted to do in their first year. They were talking about a lot of different things. There was a bunch of executive orders issued in that first week. And it's hard to say any of that uncertainty has gone away. But I really wanted in this post to try to focus on what can we say has happened in the past year? What are the things that have had an impact? And when you look in broad strokes at the commodity market, oil, natural gas, both maybe price-wise aren't all that different from where they were a year ago. Oil's gone down a little bit, although that's in the past week or two started ramping up with potential conflict in Iran. Natural gas prices are actually at this point pretty close to on par with where they were a year ago. Now, over the past year, both of those markets have seen big swings, and those swings have resulted from a variety of actions, some of which relate to the Trump administration. Others are weather. For example, the storm we had this past week had a substantial effect, especially on near-term energy prices. But I focus on oil and gas here because the administration came in with a very pro-fossil fuel agenda, and what we've seen is that the markets have been very volatile, but they're not substantially different from where they were a year ago. We still have record levels of production of oil and gas domestically. We had record levels a year ago when the Trump administration came into office. Things are a little higher now. Some permitting barriers are a little easier, but unless we see prices increase, we're not necessarily going to see a big expansion of oil and gas production because the producers tend to chase the prices. And then on the electric side, there's a really much more intricate story. We've got the Trump administration taking a very anti-renewable stance, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the permitting issues I've mentioned. There's certainly a number of headwinds against renewables right now. Any of us here in New England know about what's been going on with offshore winds. Projects have been blocked and then delayed, and then court orders have been issued, and then follow-up appeals have happened, and those projects have had to deal with a lot in 1 year. And many of them, in doing that, are incurring massive costs and have disrupted construction timelines. But in general, the roadblocks that the Trump administration has put up to more renewable development have come at the expense of not having a lot of new generation sources. Solar and wind primarily fill a lot of the new interconnection queues around the country for new generation, which this is coming at a time where we're seeing most of the country, most grids around the country, expecting massive amounts of load growth in the next few years, mostly as a result of data centers and to a lesser extent electrification. And this is the first time in recent history we're seeing those big growth projections for more electric demand. And so you're starting to see grid planners raise the alarm bell that, hey, we're seeing demand and it's going to keep increasing, but in terms of the resources we have to meet that demand and the transmission capacity, we're not keeping pace. And so that is a really interesting dynamic to see how that has played out over the past year and how it will continue to play out, because it's got massive implications not only for the energy industry, but also everyone who depends on the energy industry, and particularly data centers and the AI companies.
Big focus in your article is this idea of supply and demand, and increased demand and not increasing supply, meaning prices going up and needing to build out infrastructure for added demand. We have this idea of the data centers, but also, Trump talked about onshoring manufacturing more, which would then create energy demand as well if we actually accomplish that goal. And talked about natural gas, the wait times and the equipment for natural gas fired generators, and that being a delay. And people have talked about renewables being potentially the fastest new energy source you can bring on if you actually let permitting happen.
Yeah.
Which we're seeing roadblocks on that. So we're seeing more expensive renewables due to permitting and cutback on tax credits and withholding of funding. At the same time, you're seeing potentially more expensive natural gas equipment, and then you have the equipment for upgrading the grid in general and transistors, and then you have this idea of, okay, now we're going to start exporting liquefied natural gas, and then that potentially brings up the cost of gas domestically. So doesn't look great on the affordability forefront, it sounds like.
Yeah, this is where that affordability discussion has its roots, right? And we're hearing so much of that this year in particular with midterm elections coming up, with a lot of states looking at state elections, big gubernatorial race here in Maine, and affordability is front and center, especially in New England, and we've seen that recently in some of the races in New Jersey and other states in the Mid-Atlantic too. I'm glad you read the article clearly very well and retained a lot of all of these various points that feed into this situation, because it's complicated and it's not, the solution is not an easy one. It's not as easy as finger pointing that this is all a result of Trump administration actions or all a result of data center growth. And but it has created the situation you've sort of laid out, where when you look at all these factors combined, you've seen groups like the North American Electricity Reliability Council release their annual report this year and actually start to raise some major concerns about reliability over the next 5 years. And that report is one that all the grid planners use, and as they think about what do we need to do to make sure our grid has adequate resource capacity to meet the demand projections. And over half of the grids in the country were flagged as having some concern. So there's that concern, and as you mentioned, it may lead into further price spikes. I think on the flip side, I've been trying to temper that fear that we're just going to see escalating prices indefinitely. I mean, we've seen a lot of policymakers start to look at the levers they can pull at the state level to maybe cut back on state programs, especially cut back on programs that might be at odds with what the federal administration is promoting. We've seen some of the New England states start to look at their renewable programs and say, should we cut back on these? Are they adding costs at a time where renewables are getting more costly? But at the same time, when you see load growth generally, that helps to bring prices down. And so at some point here in the foreseeable future, if we see a bunch of new data centers and we see a bunch of this load growth materialize, electrification, et cetera, that should help. And so some of this is a question really about cost allocation and timing. And it takes really good planning and coordination, which is hard when you've got a very fractured political environment.
Yeah, I mean, you have people's stated desire, and then you have policies, and they don't always meet people's stated desire, and conflicting headwinds in different directions, where you care about affordability, but you have tariffs, or you have these other things that then increase costs. And just the idea of this instability in general. How do you invest in infrastructure or in increasing capacity if you're uncertain of what's going to happen next? And interesting to me, you look back at the Biden administration, you had a lot of conservatives saying, we need an all of the above energy approach. And then the Trump administration, they're focused on an oil and gas and maybe nuclear approach, but not an all of the above approach, and are making it hard to build some of these renewable projects in an affordable or timely manner. And so if you personally, I'm thinking all of the above approach, okay, you're not unleashing energy dominance if you're not willing to unleash electrification and these renewable sources as well as other sources.
There's definitely a contradiction there, and unsurprising that the Trump administration has taken a lot of stances and then quickly pivoted. They keep you on your toes, and I think the contradiction in that policy approach is pretty obvious. Where on I think day one, the Trump administration declared we have a national energy emergency. For many of us in the energy industry, we were saying, what does that mean, or what is an energy emergency? That was really just sort of a new declaration that I think was intended to give some of those executive powers, more power than they would have had otherwise. But that energy emergency, in many ways, has only gotten worse over the past year because, to your point, we've seen the solar and wind projects that filled a lot of the interconnection queues encounter delays or potential permitting issues. The interconnection problem remains a major one that's unresolved for many of the grids around the country. And then at the same time, as you mentioned, natural gas generation has gotten a lot more expensive because of the increasing demand for it. And so altogether, we're just setting up a much more difficult scenario to meet our needs in the future than it needs to be due to some of these policies. So I certainly think there's some contradiction there, and something that really goes against what I think folks inherently believe that the Trump administration is really trying to bring less globalization and more reliance on energy and products developed here in the U.S. And renewables fit that bill pretty well. However, their supply chains do run through other countries, and that's something that provides another big variable here, especially the solar and battery storage industries, where they're very reliant on supply chains that run through parts of Asia, China, and those are parts that have been targeted by the Trump administration. And so that's created some further problems for the industry.
Well, the geopolitics is really fascinating. You obviously have supply chain and tariffs, but we have an environment where energy is being used as soft power and an economic weapon. You had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which caused prices to spike, and Europe saying we can't rely on these oil and gas imports from Russia. We need to diversify, and that also led to us look at more LNG exports to Europe, but Europe electrifying more. And you have China as well. Like, U.S. has become this oil powerhouse exporter and gas, and China is reliant, on foreign source of energy. And so one of the reasons they've invested a ton into the renewables and electrification and EVs is their own energy independence and then becoming exporter of that technology. And so that's raised these flags of saying, okay, if we're relying on Chinese technology, are we then, or Chinese manufacturing capacity, are we then, becoming energy reliant? But then I've listened to other folks and they say, well, you buy a solar panel and then it's from China, it can operate for 20 years, as opposed to if China's reliant on natural gas or oil, you have to supply that continuously, and you could cut them off and have immediate sharp pain. Mm-hmm. So in the 20 years, if China cut us off on a solar panel, we could just build our own solar panels. But the challenge is not the solar panel, right? It's the rare earth minerals.
Yep.
And them dominating the supply chain of that, which then leads to all these environmental and other impacts of if we want to onshore, friendshore these rare earth mineral production refining capacities, there's definitely an environmental impact. And you have things like in Maine, this lithium deposit. Mm-hmm. And so we're like, we use lithium in Maine, in our batteries in your phone, in your car and whatnot, but we're hesitant to mine stuff like that in our state, even though we use it. So it brings in all these questions of how can we really onshore or friendshore these things, and what is the cost implication or energy independence implication of these things?
Right, we've built these globalized systems that have been built up over decades, and so it's hard to unwind them. And this is happening, I think, across a lot of arenas right now. Not just energy, is folks are actually having to take a hard look at unwinding that globalized system and starting to focus on, given the current environment, given not only the Trump administration but Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some of the geopolitical rifts we've seen develop in the last few years. You've got this big focus on domestic production and onshoring, to your point. When you think about that alongside some of these energy problems that really take a globalized approach and take a massive systems to fix, it's hard to see how the future works and how the future is not much more expensive if we're all going to try to guard what we have. These are some really tricky problems, and I'm glad I'm not the one trying to resolve all of them.
You're keeping an eye on all these things.
We are.
And offering advice of how do you navigate it in the near term or longer term. And the oil prices you mentioned earlier is interesting to me. We have a president who kind of says, "Oh, I'm like the best friend of the oil companies," but oil companies don't necessarily like low oil prices. There's a saying in the industry, basically like, you grow during the Republican administrations and you make your money during the Democrat administrations. Because, maybe there's less regulations on them, but when oil prices are low, they're not making any money. They can't actually expand their production because, we've had the shale revolution, and it has been a revolutionary game changer, but it is potentially more expensive to bring out, this shale product than cheaper products. So if the cost is low, we don't increase production in the United States. To me, it's interesting. I don't know if you've thought about this aspect of it, of if we actually reach that point where we are doing more electrification, relying less on oil, there's all these countervailing dynamics where then there's even more glut of supply, and then oil prices drop even more, and then because oil is so low, maybe that slows electrification. So you have this whole thing where electrification increases and then it potentially lowers the cost of oil, but then at a certain point, having two operating systems is too expensive. You have to go, further in one direction, and oil will then become more expensive potentially because we have all this infrastructure that's not being used and then you got to pay for that.
It is a challenge right now where you have, I mentioned some of the states that are reviewing their renewable programs. Many of these same states, especially here in New England, have been promoting electrification as, the way that their states are going to decarbonize their energy systems. And you have that occurring at a time where electricity prices have escalated pretty substantially. When you look at the studies comparing the rates of energy prices against the rates of inflation, it's not true everywhere, but in the Northeast, we certainly have that story where the rates of electricity have exceeded the rates of inflation. But the drivers behind that cost, to some of your points here, are not necessarily entirely the state policies driving those costs. We've got the price of natural gas, which is really what dictates the wholesale cost of electricity. The cost of actually producing those electrons has been very volatile and has gone up to a small degree over the past year, especially as we're exporting more of our domestically produced gas. And the prices, while having spiked in the near term this winter, haven't supported massive growth in production. We've remained at these very, very high points, but we're not seeing marked changes in how much more gas we're producing. So as that gas prices maybe converge on a global market that's now more enabled by more LNG export capacity, which is something that the Biden administration had paused more export terminals. The Trump administration undid that pause. We're looking at LNG export capacity in the US that could double in the next few years. And as that happens, if production doesn't keep pace, that's undoubtedly going to continue to raise our price here domestically and will be more akin to what folks on the global market are paying. New England, we've always had some exposure to that global market because during the winter months, we don't have enough pipeline capacity to get natural gas into our region. And this is one of the reasons why our electricity prices have gotten very expensive in the winter, is that we have a lot of gas needed for heating, a lot of that gas also needed for electrical generation. And on those very cold days when our demand for gas exceeds what we can pipe in, we're importing LNG gas to help supplement our supplies. And then we're relying on other resources. This winter, we've seen a lot of oil generation on the New England grid, more oil generation than we've seen in years on the New England grid because of the very cold temperatures we've had. And so it raises, I think, maybe similar points to what you've brought up, where as you think about these movements towards electrification and the way our electricity prices function, they're inherently tied to some of these fossil fuel markets until we build out the renewables and storage systems that would ultimately displace some of that natural gas and oil generation.
To bring it back to costs, now fortunately there seems to be bipartisan agreement that we need some form of permitting reform, and permitting reform potentially benefits all types of energy production, oil and gas as well as renewables. But one of the sticking points is Democrats are hesitant to come to the table on the national scene, because if the Trump administration can just pause a project, even if it's been approved, like offshore wind, then they're saying, well, this is supposedly bipartisan and technology neutral, but then if the president can just pause all the projects he doesn't like, which we've seen in the past, other administration pausing, pipeline projects. So are you monitoring, where we are with permitting reform?
You've laid out the dynamic well, that there is, I think, some good bipartisan consensus that we need permitting reform. And I think, if you can do it holistically, you can enable more fossil fuel projects and more renewable projects, and it benefits all interests. I think you're absolutely right that with the way the Trump administration and the executive right now has used existing permitting processes to sort of pick favorites, it's hard to bring both sides to the table. And I do think one of the reasons why I'm somewhat optimistic that some of these bipartisan efforts would work is that there's so much focus and concern around AI and our ability to keep up with the AI race and keep up with the data center build out that AI is going to require. That concern, that security concern, overrides other fears about which energy projects we might be relying on. And I think that's been the driver behind some of this bipartisan effort. I mean, you saw, I think at this point, maybe a month or two ago, the Trump administration, along with both Democratic and Republican governors in the Mid-Atlantic, calling on PJM, the Mid-Atlantic grid operator, to address some of the issues that they're seeing with data center build out and capacity prices escalating as a result. You also saw, I think last week, a bipartisan bill introduced that would require data centers to build resources as they interconnect. And there's a variety of viewpoints on how we get those data centers to be built, but all of them require more generation and more infrastructure. And so you've got to address some of the permitting issues, and you've got to address some of the bottlenecks if you're ever going to meet that need. And that need is one that a lot of folks are prioritizing, including, I think, the Trump administration. So that gives me some optimism that there's enough emphasis to try to get over this hurdle, that maybe we can see some good quality negotiations and a good outcome. But it's hard to say.
We talk about affordability and free market. You have places like Texas who has brought on a lot of wind and solar, and they don't necessarily love renewables, but they love the cost effectiveness of how do you bring on generation affordably and timely. You look at a place like Maine or New England, we have a lot of policies that may be admirable insulating low income customers from price spikes, or hopefully doing that. But if prices aren't responsive to the actual cost, we were looking at doing more with time of use billing and other strategies to address that. But if people don't change their behavior, or you don't incentivize bringing in innovative solutions through price mechanisms, then maybe we're not getting the grid of the future by trying to be nice about price. We're actually not addressing the things that are raising the prices.
There's a lot to unpack there. There's definitely the rate design piece that's tricky. The Texas example is an interesting one. What Texas has that's really been a nice benefit is that they operate their grid pretty much independently, and it's just the state of Texas. It's ERCOT looking at their grid, and that's enabled them to do some transmission planning that we haven't been able to see in the multi-state regional cooperatives, because it requires multiple states to collaborate, and it requires some states to cede that, yeah, this project may benefit one state more than another state, and those are difficult negotiations, whereas Texas can say this transmission project is in our state's interest, and therefore we're going to approve it and get it built. And they've been successful in building out some of their transmission infrastructure in ways that other state and regional entities haven't been successful, because it's required more interstate coordination and work alongside the federal government. And Texas has been able to sort of do what it does, stay independent and done its own thing, and it's enabled some of the renewable build out. Plus they have the strong solar and wind resource, and they've got fairly cheap land and very low permitting barriers at the state level. And so all of those things point to I think maybe some good lessons to take to your point about when we're putting up maybe all of these intricate programs and trying to find workarounds, we can complicate a system that makes it hard to get through for permitting. It makes it hard to coordinate between states. I think this is some of the emphasis behind these permitting reforms is, hey, can we look at the states and the places where permitting processes are easy and quick, where we are seeing building work, building new infrastructure, building new resources, and can we take those lessons and apply them at the national scale? It's hard when it requires the different states to maybe give up some of their own power, or different factions within the political parties to give up some power and concede a point to the other side.
But we are seeing more collaboration, right, in ISO New England, and looking at something like onshore wind in Aroostook County, and other states potentially helping pay to tie in transmission to bring that energy into other states. And this idea that we are part of one grid, so if we are bringing energy in, like any CEC example, that bringing in energy into Massachusetts actually helps the price of everybody, because we're all on this interconnected grid.
For both the reason that many of the New England states have a similar goal around needing more renewable resources, and they have a similar goal around trying to reduce prices for their ratepayers. And I think that's led to some good interstate coordination, but I don't know, NECEC was incredibly hard to build. If you ask anyone involved, and that doesn't maybe set a good example of how we may see more transmission get built if we have to go through similar sort of hurdles and processes. It's going to be difficult, and I understand where some of those difficulties and some of the opposition to NECEC lie, but it's at some point, if we want this fully electrified future and we want this future where we rely on more renewables, we're going to need the infrastructure to support it, and concessions have to be made, and it's just having the impetus to do that.
Well, I think NECEC is a great example from multiple sides of what they would not want to see, whether you are for it or against it.
Yeah.
The process was not easy, and was not timely, and was not cost effective necessarily. To go through the process the way we did. And hopefully we've learned lessons to both address people's concerns as well as do so in a timely manner.
Yeah.
So your background, how did you get passionate about energy?
Yeah, I've been passionate about the environment, environmental issues, really since I was young. Just enjoying spending time outside. Growing up, being a Boy Scout, doing a lot of camping. You develop that passion for the outdoors and preserving your environment. And then, from there, I definitely had pretty interdisciplinary interests in my academics, and energy just sits at a really nice intersection where you get some of the sort of the hard sciences, some of the really interesting policy and regulatory questions, some of the social and equity questions when it comes to rate design. And I love the fact that you can dabble in all of those different fields throughout the day when you work in the energy industry, and in particular, at CES, where we're working with a wide range of clients, I get to view the industry from a variety of lenses, and you get to put on the hat of a large corporation who might have certain priorities, and then that afternoon you get to swap hats for a small municipality who's trying to institute some new state program or take advantage of some grant opportunity. And seeing energy from all those different angles is keeps things interesting, and also gives you a nice perspective, a broad perspective on the industry, and putting all these systems together, which is something that definitely is intellectually stimulating and excites me every day.
One of the things that was brought up in the legislative breakfast E2 Tech had on February 5th was the idea of the pendulum swing, both on the national and on the state level. You get really excited about something and you incentivize it, and then you pull back. And having more consistency and stability, how do we achieve that? And that being better at sparking, more investment than just, here's a really great program. If people can trust that the rules aren't going to change when they build something, especially retroactively in general, that creates an environment where investment can happen. And all these projects of all energy types require investment, and stability and collaboration matters. And you had PUC Chair Phil Bartlett on the energy panel saying it'd be great if there's an opportunity for some of these stakeholders to convene and hopefully get on the same page a little bit before they end up at a PUC hearing. And my hope is that in some small way, E2 Tech can be one way to bring different stakeholders together and have conversations that help move the process forward in a collaborative and thoughtful way. And you are on the board of the E2 Tech, so I wanted to ask you, why are you a member? What do you see as the benefits of being a member of E2 Tech?
I mean, I think that's the number one, is being a convener, being a venue through which all of the stakeholders in this very broad energy and environmental and technology sector can come together, share ideas, share new technologies, share things that you're working on. I mean, for me and CES in particular, we are working with a wide variety of energy users. And so our exposure in these conversations to what may be coming from the policy side, what are the latest ideas from the rate making or rate design front, what are the new technologies that maybe the grid or our clients might need to adapt to in the future. Learning about all of those at E2 Tech events helps us be more informed, helps us do our jobs better, and then also helps us make meaningful connections to others who are working on these projects in the industry, and hopefully lead to that wider scale collaboration that leads to better policy, better regulatory environment. And to your point, I mean, I think it's worth emphasizing stability is really, especially for energy projects, these are projects that you're making an investment and you're expecting something's going to be there for 20, 30, 40 years, because that's the lifespan of some of these projects, or longer. And so having some view of how things may look over that 20, 30 year time horizon is critical. And so, I think hearing more and more of a variety of stakeholders voice that same message hopefully helps policymakers and regulators, hear that and factor that in as they're thinking about designing the next wave of programs.
Any questions or thoughts, Elizabeth, our amazing program operations manager behind the scenes here?
I guess I don't know that this would be an aside on the conversation, but we mentioned a lot about data centers earlier. I guess, there's a lot of new data coming out, some of it even in the past week, about how much water usage factor into data centers. And I think for one of the first times they're announcing that there's a water bankruptcy, basically. I'm wondering how that might factor into any of the decisions or advice that Competitive Energy Services gives their clients.
Yeah, that's a great question. We are energy experts and not water experts. So I'll lead with that. That question can be very regional. I think there's some areas where you're going to have major water concerns, other areas where that will be very low on the list of concerns with the data center. With the amount of consumption they're bringing for both water and energy just requires these long-term solutions, these solutions that can factor in multiple stakeholders. What is the impact on ratepayers? What is the impact on the existing infrastructure that we have? And being able to plan around, I understand there's a lot of interest and motivation towards getting these data centers built, but just doing so in a thoughtful way so that as they're built, you're not adding massive amounts of consumption that a local water district or that a local utility can't handle. And those are questions that need to be asked, and those questions are coming up. It's just they're also slowing things down, so it's a tricky road to walk.
We see a lot of news about increasing energy demand, but then there's also the opportunity for these AI data centers to play a role in virtual power plants and helping us use less energy or use energy more efficiently or shave the peaks or come up with innovative solutions for energy generation even. And you have folks like the clean tech incubators at the Rue Institute here in Maine, and a lot of the startups are utilizing AI in their solutions. And so to me, there's a big question there, and maybe we'll explore that in a future panel discussion of what are the potential positive and negatives. Like personally, if it's just creating AI slop memes, that's not a great use of energy. But if we're actually doing things like pattern recognitions on drugs to cure cancer or to make virtual power plants, then that is, potentially positive use and potentially worth the energy use and investment and infrastructure build out.
Two big points on data centers from an energy perspective. One, I think you hit the nail on the head that one of the big questions is how flexible can their load be? Because when people talk about the major costs associated with a data center build out, it's not necessarily the volume of consumption, it's the fact that you are adding all that consumption around the clock. And so at times where the grid is particularly stressed, a hot summer afternoon or the middle of a winter storm, if it's consuming the same amount and you need to supply that, now it adds tremendous costs and tremendous strain to the grid from an infrastructure standpoint. But if you can use some of these technologies, pair it with batteries, pair it with things that could help to shave those peaks, reduce the data center demand during peak periods, now you can add a lot more data centers at a fraction of the cost. And I think that's been one of the major questions around this data center build out and whether enough of that can happen and how do you ensure that happens.
Well, and it doesn't have to necessarily be the data center reducing their energy directly. They can pay for programs that then the consumer signs up for a program where they reduce their energy and get paid for that during the peaks.
Then, in fact, the data center can offer a really nice benefit of being a new ratepayer who's got a massive volume of consumption, and that hopefully brings down the cost of electricity for all of the consumers in that region. So there is a view here where this data center build out ultimately benefits ratepayers, but it's got to be done thoughtfully and with the right incentives in place.
Are there any final thoughts, final words you have to share with our listeners?
This has been a great conversation. If you're interested in these types of conversations, this is what CES does every day. If you are having trouble navigating this world, please reach out. This is something that we advise clients on. There's a lot going on. It's what keeps us in business, gives us a job to do. And so we'd love to talk to you about those problems or talk to you about these issues anytime.
Yeah, I don't necessarily see the energy world getting so simple that we don't need analysts like yourself. So look forward to having future conversations with you about where things stand, maybe next year, maybe sooner.
Yeah.
The Environmental and Energy Technology Council of Maine is a nonpartisan nonprofit. We want to bring together multiple perspectives to share data-driven, fact-based conversations. If you agree or disagree with anything we said today, is not the opinion of E2 Tech as an organization. And we invite disagreement. And I might have said stuff that may not agree with what your fact-based opinion is, and welcome your feedback. Welcome you to reach out, get involved, share your perspective, because by having these conversations, I think that's a way that we can move forward together and find solution to these energy problems. So thank you for joining us on E2 Tech's new podcast, the Environmental and Energy Technology Council of Maine. Thank you to our listeners. You can find more about E2 Tech at e2tech.org. And thank you to our guest today, Matt Gamache, Competitive Energy Services.
Thanks, Ryan.
E2 Tech Podcast.